While I was lovingly setting the table, preparing her favorite cake, and waiting for a visit that never came, my ungrateful daughter Laura was spending my life's sweat on luxury shopping at the most expensive mall in the city. But what I discovered after that was much worse than a forgotten birthday, because this real story of mine will show you that sometimes the closest people are capable of the worst betrayals, and that revenge can come from where you least expect it. I woke up that March 23rd with my heart full of hope, set the kitchen table with 2 extra plates because I was absolutely certain that Laura and Jason would come for dinner. The sweet smell of cake filled my house, mixed with the scent of flowers I had bought especially for the moment. Hours went by, and my ungrateful daughter was nowhere to be seen. I kept looking out the window at every car sound, thinking they had finally arrived. The phone remained silent on the living room table, not even a single call to wish me happy birthday. When 8 o'clock came, I finally admitted to myself that there wouldn't be any visit. The cake remained whole, the candles unlit, and that feeling of abandonment grew in my chest like a heavy stone. Jeez, how can a daughter completely forget her own mother's birthday? The next day, I was still a bit shaken when the phone rang. It was my longtime friend, Carol Jenkins, with news that would change everything. "Eleanor, dear, you won't believe where I saw Laura yesterday afternoon," Carol said, and her voice sounded strange, somewhat hesitant. She was at Westfield Shopping, that super expensive mall downtown, loaded with Louis Vuitton and Chanel bags, and Jason was with her, all elegant, looking like they had just come from a party. I felt my stomach churn. So my daughter hadn't forgotten my birthday. She simply chose to go shopping instead of visiting me. That revelation affected me so much that I decided to do something I had never done before. Check my bank accounts on the computer. I'm not very good with technology, but I managed to access the bank system with help from the neighbor's grandson. What I saw on the screen left me breathless. In the last 12 months, regular transfers had been made from my account to an account I didn't recognize. They weren't small amounts. No, sir. Adding everything up, more than $40,000 had disappeared from savings I had kept for decades. And the worst part? The dates coincided exactly with the loving visits Laura made to help with my finances. The discovery was like taking a punch to the stomach. I sat there looking at the numbers on the screen, trying to understand how I had been so naive. Each transfer had happened right after Laura came with excuses that she needed to better organize my papers, always offering help with that sweet smile I thought was genuine. Now everything made sense. The expensive clothes my gold-digging son-in-law always wore, the new house they had bought with an inheritance from Jason's uncle, and especially the way they always changed the subject when I asked about money. The emotional story I thought I was living with my daughter was, in reality, a cruel farce. The silence in my house had never seemed so heavy. I turned off the computer with trembling hands and went to sit in the living room armchair, the same one where I used to wait for visits that I now knew were self-serving. $40,000. It was almost everything I had managed to save after my husband's death. How can a mother discover she was robbed by her own daughter? And what else would I discover if I kept investigating? One thing was certain. That forgotten birthday had revealed much more than I ever imagined possible, and what I decided to do after that would surprise everyone, including you who are listening to my story. After 3 days mulling over that discovery, I gathered courage and decided to call Laura. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it would come out of my mouth, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't seen anything. When she answered with that sweet voice as always, I almost lost my courage, but then I remembered the $40,000 that had disappeared from my account. "Laura, dear, I need to talk to you about some transfers that appeared on my bank statements," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The silence on the other end of the line was so cold, you could feel the temperature change. This elderly mother here wasn't going to be fooled so easily anymore. My ungrateful daughter's reaction was the most shocking thing I've ever witnessed in my life. Instead of explaining herself or apologizing, she laughed. Yes, she laughed in my face. "Mom, you're getting paranoid in old age. What transfers are these?" she said, as if I were a child making up stories. When I mentioned the exact amounts and dates, her tone changed completely. "Look, Mom, that money was a debt from a favor you owed me. Did you forget all the times I helped you with your bills and paperwork? The coldness in her voice gave me chills. What do you mean, debt from a favor? I never asked her to mess with my finances, much less owed her anything. That's when Jason entered the conversation. And my goodness, what a gold-digging son-in-law this man turned out to be. I could hear him whispering with Laura in the background. And then she came back to the phone with a completely different attitude. Jason wants to talk to you, she said. And when he took the phone, his voice was cold as ice. Eleanor, with all due respect, but you would never need all that money anyway. A person your age, living alone. What's all that money sitting in the account for? I was speechless. How could he talk like that about my life, my sweat, my savings? This man's audacity had no limits. The conversation took a turn I never imagined possible in a family. Jason, who I thought was an honest lawyer, started threatening me in a way that left me trembling from head to toe. Eleanor, you need to understand that we're trying to protect you, he said with that voice of someone who's used to intimidating people in court. A woman your age, making unfounded accusations against her own daughter. That's not normal. Maybe it would be better for you to sign some papers transferring the house to Laura's name, so she can better take care of your interests. The threat was clear as water. Either I agreed, or they would cause me even worse problems. When I understood he was suggesting I no longer had the mental capacity to take care of my own affairs, I felt a rage I didn't know existed inside me. Jason, are you threatening me? I asked, and his answer was even more frightening. It's not a threat, Eleanor. It's legal advice. I have several colleagues who work with elderly guardianship cases. It would be very easy to prove that you no longer have the conditions to manage your assets. My heart raced. He was talking about taking control of my own life away from me. This marriage that I had welcomed so much into my family was revealing itself to be a pair of predators. How could I have been so blind not to see the signs before? The call ended with Laura returning to the phone, trying to smooth things over with that falseness I now recognized perfectly. Mom, don't worry about this, okay? Jason sometimes exaggerates, but he only wants what's best for you. You should think about what he said about the house. It would be better for everyone. Before I could answer anything, she hung up. I stood there, holding the silent phone, trying to process what had just happened. My own daughter and my son-in-law had just robbed me, humiliated me, and threatened me all in one phone call. Did they really think I would stay quiet and accept all this? This emotional story was far from over. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I walked around the house, looking at family photos on the wall, trying to understand when everything had changed so much. Photos from Laura's wedding, her all smiling in my lap when she was a baby, the Christmases we spent together. How had the girl I raised with so much love become a person capable of betraying me like this? And Jason, whom I welcomed with open arms into the family, whom I even called son in my heart. The worst part was knowing they thought they had cornered me, that an elderly mother like me wouldn't have the courage or means to fight back. But they had no idea what this little old lady was still capable of doing. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. I kept thinking about Jason's words about guardianship, about declaring me incompetent, about losing my house. Did they really have that power? Was I too alone to face this battle? For a moment I thought about calling Laura again, trying to find middle ground, maybe accepting that the money was gone for good and moving on. But then I remembered their tone of voice, the coldness, the disrespect. No, this wasn't going to stay like this. If they thought they could intimidate me, they were dead wrong. This war was just beginning. Dawn came with a certainty growing in my chest. I needed professional help, and I needed it fast. I couldn't face a lawyer alone. I didn't have enough knowledge about laws and rights, but I also knew I couldn't trust just anyone. After what I had discovered about people so close to me, how could I know whom to trust? Fear and determination were fighting inside me, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to give up. $40,000 was a lot of money, but my dignity and my freedom were worth much more. And if Jason thought he could scare me with legal threats, he was about to discover he had messed with the wrong person. After that terrible call, I spent 2 days locked at home, feeling completely lost and betrayed. But on the third day, a voice inside me said, Eleanor, you can't give up like this. I remembered a community center a few blocks from my house. where I always saw people my age coming and going. I had never had the courage to go in there before. I've always been kind of reserved. But at that moment, I felt I needed to leave the house and talk to someone. I put on my best clothes, combed my hair carefully, and went out to the street, determined not to let myself be beaten down by this situation. If my own ungrateful daughter had abandoned me, maybe it was time to find other people who could understand me. The community center was more welcoming than I imagined. It had a nice smell of coffee and freshly baked cookies, and people seemed really happy to be there. I felt a bit out of place at first. I didn't really know how these group things work, but a gray-haired lady with a warm smile came to talk to me. "First time here, dear?" she asked, and something in her voice made me feel I could trust her. "I'm Eleanor Hayes," I introduced myself, "and I'm going through some very complicated family problems." She introduced herself as Dorothy and took me to meet other people, but it was when she mentioned Dr. Evelyn Reed that my ears perked up. She works with family therapy and has already helped many people here with serious problems, Dorothy said. Dr. Evelyn Reed wasn't anything like what I expected from a therapist. She was about 50 years old, brown hair pulled back in a casual bun, and had a way of speaking that was both professional and maternal. When I briefly told her about the situation with Laura and Jason, she didn't seem surprised at all. "Eleanor, unfortunately, cases of family financial abuse are more common than people imagine," she said, and just hearing someone call it by its right name, abuse, made me feel less alone. She explained that often children take advantage of their elderly parents' trust, especially when they think no one will discover or question it. For the first time in days, I didn't feel like a foolish old woman who had been deceived. I had been the victim of a crime. During our conversation, Dr. Evelyn showed me I wasn't the only elderly mother going through this. "I've been following similar cases for years, Eleanor, and I can tell you one thing. You have more rights and options than you imagine," she said, pulling out a folder full of papers. She explained about elderly protection laws, about how to document evidence, and especially how to protect myself from the threats Jason had made about guardianship. "They're trying to intimidate you because they know they did something wrong. A person with full mental capacity, as you clearly have, doesn't lose their rights that easily." I felt enormous relief. So I wasn't crazy, and they couldn't simply declare me incompetent just because they wanted to. The most important part of the conversation came when Dr. Evelyn mentioned Dr. Daniel Miller, a lawyer specializing in elderly law, who had an excellent reputation in the city. "He's honest, Eleanor, and has a lot of experience with family financial abuse cases. More importantly, he understands that behind each case, there's a real story of a person who was hurt by those they loved most." She gave me his card and offered to call to schedule a consultation. My goodness, after so much coldness from my own family, finding people willing to truly help me moved me to tears. Finally, this emotional story was going to take a different direction. Dr. Daniel Miller worked in a small but organized office, full of law books and some plants that gave a welcoming touch to the environment. When I entered, he stood up to greet me with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. He was a man in his 60s, gray hair, and that paternal way that reminded me of my late husband. "Mrs. Eleanor, Dr. Evelyn briefly told me about your situation. I want you to know that everything we discuss here stays between us, and my goal is to protect your rights and your dignity." Right away, I realized he was different. He wasn't just interested in money. He was genuinely concerned about me as a person. When I finished telling the whole story, from the forgotten birthday to Jason's threats, Dr. Miller was silent for a few minutes, taking notes in a small notebook. Then he looked at me with a serious but confident expression. "Eleanor, what your daughter and son-in-law did constitutes the crime of embezzlement and financial abuse of an elderly person, and his threats about guardianship are completely unfounded. You are lucid, have full capacity, and no judge will consider you incompetent based on empty accusations." Hearing this from a professional was like taking a huge weight off my shoulders. He explained the next steps: gather documents, file police reports, and especially prepare for possible more serious intimidation attempts. Dr. Miller gave me practical advice I would never have thought of alone. "From now on, Eleanor, every interaction with them needs to be documented. If they call, record the conversation. It's legal here in the state. If they show up at your house, don't open the door alone. And especially, they'll probably try some desperate maneuver when they find out you sought legal help. He gave me his card with his personal number and said I could call any time if needed. Geez, from an abandoned and robbed elderly mother, I was becoming a person with a team of professionals supporting me. I left that office feeling like a completely different person from the one who had entered. Dr. Evelyn and Dr. Miller had shown me I wasn't alone, that I had rights, and especially that it wasn't too late to fight for justice. I walked down the street with my head held high, thinking about how my ungrateful daughter and my gold-digging son-in-law would be surprised when they discovered that the defenseless little old lady had found powerful allies. Their marriage, built at my expense, was going to face a battle they never imagined possible. This war was far from over, and now I had the right weapons to win. Not even a week after my consultation with Dr. Miller, they showed up. It was a Thursday morning. I was calmly having my coffee when I heard the sound of a key in the front door lock. My heart raced. Laura still had the key I had given her years ago, for emergencies. I heard her voice and Jason's in the hallway, speaking low but in urgent tones. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk," Laura shouted, and the tone was completely different from that fake sweetness as usual. It was authoritative, impatient. This elderly mother here already knew they hadn't come for a social visit. They had come to war. I appeared in the living room, and the scene I saw alarmed me. Jason was carrying a folder of documents under his arm, and Laura had that look of someone who wasn't going to accept no for an answer. "Mom, sit there so we can resolve this confusion once and for all," she said, pointing to the sofa as if I were a disobedient child. Jason opened the folder and spread the papers on the coffee table, all full of fine print and legal words I didn't quite understand. "Eleanor, we brought some documents here that will make your life easier. Just sign and that's it. You won't have any more headaches with these silly things about bank accounts and house management." The audacity of that gold-digging son-in-law had no limits. He was trying to convince me to sign papers I didn't even know what they were. When I approached the table to try to read the documents, I felt my hands start to tremble. It wasn't from fear. It was from pure indignation. Those papers were to transfer my house to their name and give them full power of attorney over my finances. "You're completely crazy if you think I'm going to sign this," I said, pushing the papers away. Laura's reaction was explosive. "Mom, you're not seeing reality. You're no longer young enough to take care of all this alone." She spoke as if I were incapable, a child who didn't know what was best for herself. But Dr. Miller had prepared me for exactly this situation. They were going to try to pressure me when they realized I was no longer the defenseless little old lady they thought. That's when Jason completely lost his composure and showed his true face. When I said I had sought a lawyer and knew my rights, he turned red with rage. "Eleanor, you don't know who you're messing with," he said, approaching me with clenched fists. "You're a stubborn old woman who doesn't understand that we're trying to help you. If you don't sign these papers willingly, you'll sign them unwillingly." The threat was clear, but what really shocked me was when he pushed me. Yes, he put his hand on my shoulder and pushed me hard, making me stumble. At that moment, I realized this real story had gotten completely out of control, and they were capable of anything. I managed to balance myself by holding onto the edge of the table, but I was so scared I started screaming. "Get out of my house! You have no right to threaten me, much less assault me." Laura tried to ease the situation, but it was too late. "Mom, Jason's just nervous because he cares about you. Please, be reasonable." But I was no longer the submissive Eleanor of before. I kept screaming, asking them to leave, and that's when I heard my neighbor's voice, Mrs. Rose Turner, from the other side of the fence. "Is everything okay there, Eleanor?" she shouted, and I had never been so happy to hear someone's voice in my life. Mrs. Rose Turner was a woman in her 65s, but with the energy of young people and a sense of justice I had admired for years. When she heard the commotion, she didn't hesitate for a second. She jumped over the low fence that separated our yards and came knocking on my door. "Eleanor, open up, it's me, Rose," she shouted. The presence of a witness completely changed the atmosphere of the situation. Laura and Jason were visibly uncomfortable, and Jason started collecting the papers quickly. "We don't need interference from neighbors," he said. But Rose had already entered and seen the state I was in, trembling, with tears in my eyes, clearly shaken. "What did you do to Eleanor?" she asked, and her tone was of someone who wouldn't accept lies. Rose Turner wasn't one of those people who intimidate easily. When Laura tried to explain it was just a family misunderstanding, Rose looked at the papers scattered on the table and then at me. "Eleanor, do you want them to stay here?" she asked directly, and when I said no, she positioned herself between me and them. "Then you heard the homeowner. Leave now or I'll call the police." Jason still tried to intimidate her, saying he was a lawyer and she shouldn't meddle in family affairs. But Rose was already dialing 911. The emotional story was turning into a police case, and they knew they had crossed all limits. When Jason realized Rose was really going to call the police, he tried one last desperate move. "Eleanor, you're going to regret this. A woman your age, making a scene, calling police on her own daughter. This only proves you're no longer capable of living alone." But this time, I didn't get intimidated. "I know very well what you did, and now the whole neighborhood will know too," I replied, feeling stronger with Rose by my side. They left my house, huffing with rage, but I knew that was just the beginning. The marriage I had blessed so much had revealed itself to be a criminal partnership, and now they knew I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. After the police came and filed the incident report, Rose stayed with me having tea and calming me down. "Eleanor, you did the right thing. It doesn't matter if they're family. No one has the right to treat you like this," she said, holding my hand. The officer who handled the case was very kind and explained I could request a protective order if they came back to threaten me. That night, I called Dr. Miller to tell him what had happened, and he became very serious. "Eleanor, now they know you're not going to give up. Prepare yourself, because they'll probably try something even more desperate." And unfortunately, he was right. What they tried to do next was even lower than I imagined possible. 2 weeks passed since that terrible invasion, and I was starting to think maybe Laura and Jason had given up. How naive of me. On Tuesday morning, the doorbell rang, and a woman dressed in white appeared, introducing herself as Nurse Patricia from Home Care Services. She said my ungrateful daughter Laura had hired her to do a home health evaluation, and since she seemed so professional with her lab coat and medical equipment, I thought it was a genuine gesture of care. The nurse was caring, took my blood pressure, asked health questions, and we talked for almost an hour until she mentioned she needed my signature to complete the medical report. But this elderly mother here may be many things, but not stupid. When she pulled out a strangely folded paper, my instincts gave warning signals. When I insisted on reading the complete document before signing, the fake nurse, Patricia, became visibly nervous, trying to convince me it was just medical bureaucracy. When I opened the paper, I almost fell from my chair. It wasn't a medical report at all, but a power of attorney that would give full powers over all my accounts, investments, and properties to Laura and the gold-digging son-in-law Jason. The situation became tense when I screamed that she was a scammer, and it was at that moment that Dr. Miller arrived like a guardian angel. He immediately realized something was wrong, identified the document as a broad power of attorney, and threatened to call the police for attempted fraud against an elderly person. The fake nurse's desperate reaction gave everything away. She confessed, crying that Jason had devised the scheme, paying her $500, an unemployed actress, to pose as a healthcare professional. Dr. Miller called the police anyway, explaining this was qualified fraud, no longer just family financial abuse, and that now we had solid evidence against them. After they took Patricia away, Dr. Miller showed me how that false power of attorney would have left me completely defenseless. They could have sold my house and emptied my accounts without me being able to stop it. My daughter's marriage had transformed into a real criminal gang in this emotional story, and I was the main target of this real story of family betrayal. That night I couldn't sleep, thinking about how far Laura and Jason had gone, hiring someone to pose as a nurse, forging legal documents, trying to deceive me in such a cruel way. They really thought I was a defenseless old woman they could manipulate at will. But now, with the evidence we had, Dr. Miller was confident we could not only recover my money but also prosecute them criminally. "Eleanor, prepare yourself," he had told me before leaving, "because when they discover the scam failed, they'll probably try something even more desperate." and how right he was. What came next was even worse than anything I could imagine. 2 weeks after the episode with the fake nurse, I was starting to feel safer when Dr. Miller called me with news that made my world collapse. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Laura and Jason have filed a lawsuit against you." I felt my blood freeze. "What do you mean, a lawsuit against me? I was the victim in this whole story. They're asking for you to be declared mentally incapable of managing your own assets," he continued, and I almost dropped the phone. After everything they had done, the theft, the threats, the attempted fraud, now my ungrateful daughter and my gold-digging son-in-law had the audacity to sue me. This real story was turning into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Dr. Miller came to my house that same afternoon to explain the details of the lawsuit my ungrateful daughter and the gold-digging son-in-law had filed against me. We sat at the kitchen table, and he opened a folder full of official papers while explaining that they alleged I had developed paranoia in old age and distrusted everyone without reason. Every word he read was like a stab. How could they distort the reality of this real story so much? I had discovered they robbed me. This wasn't paranoia from an elderly mother. It was fact-proven by bank statements. What shocked me most was discovering the list of false witnesses they had arranged to support this emotional story of lies. They presented a certain Mr. Smith as a witness, saying he could confirm my erratic behavior. But this man barely greeted me on the street since an old argument about his dog. The allegations in the lawsuit were so absurd, they were offensive. According to them, I had persecutory delusions and believed my family was conspiring against me financially. The marriage I had blessed so much had transformed into a machine for producing legal lies against this elderly mother who only wanted justice. Dr. Miller explained that their strategy was classic in discovered financial abuse cases. When aggressors are caught, they try to reverse the situation by painting the victim as incapable. The lawsuit included testimonies from people who supposedly had witnessed my inappropriate behavior, transforming completely normal situations into evidence of mental incapacity. It was incredible how they managed to transform questions about medications at the pharmacy or forgetfulness at the supermarket into evidence against me. Every line of that lawsuit was a new betrayal in this emotional story, a new lie constructed by the gold-digging son-in-law to completely destroy me. Dr. Miller was outraged when he read the allegations about my progressive social isolation and my refusal to accept family help. "Eleanor, they're using your independence and dignity as weapons against you. It's revolting." According to the lawsuit, my resistance to accepting their control over my finances was proof of senile stubbornness and inability to recognize one's own limitations. They painted every attempt of mine to maintain my autonomy as a symptom of mental illness. It was such a perverse inversion of reality that it left me speechless. How could I defend myself against such well-constructed lies? The hearing date was set for 3 weeks later, and Dr. Miller explained we would have to prove not only that I was mentally capable, but also unmask all the lies they had constructed. "Eleanor, this is going to be the most important battle of your life. They're trying to take not only your money, but your freedom, your dignity, your right to exist as an autonomous person." He assured me we had strong evidence on our side. The bank records, the fake nurse episode, the recordings of the threats. But still, I felt a chill in my stomach, thinking about having to face my own daughter in court. What outraged me most was discovering they had searched through my entire life, looking for anything they could use against me. Dr. Miller showed me the lawsuit even included old medical records, where they highlighted that I had taken antidepressants after my husband's death. "Eleanor, they're using your pain from losing your spouse as evidence of mental instability," he said, outraged. How could they be so low? Anyone who loses their life companion needs help to overcome grief. They turned my humanity, my capacity to feel pain and overcome it, into legal ammunition against me. The cruelty of this strategy had no limits. I also discovered they had discreetly questioned some people in my social circle, trying to collect information about my behavior. The hairdresser where I cut my hair told me indignantly that Laura had shown up there asking questions about whether I'd said strange things during appointments. "Eleanor, that girl tried to convince me you had Alzheimer's and needed special care," said Carmen, my hairdresser for more than 10 years. "I told her you're one of the most lucid clients I have. It was terrifying to discover my own daughter was investigating my life as if I were a criminal, looking for any sign she could distort." Dr. Miller explained that the timing of the lawsuit was no coincidence. "Eleanor, they filed this action exactly after they learned about the failed attempt with the fake nurse. It's a defensive strategy. If they can get you declared incompetent, all the evidence we collected against them loses legal validity. It was brilliant and perverse at the same time. If the judge considered me mentally incapable, automatically my accusations would be seen as delusions, and they would go free of all charges. Even worse, they would gain legal control over all my assets, legitimizing the theft they had already committed. This real story was becoming an almost perfect legal trap. The psychological pressure was terrible. Every time I forgot where I had left my glasses or couldn't remember an actor's name on TV, I was afraid that would be used as evidence against me. Dr. Miller noticed my state and reassured me, "Eleanor, everyone forgets small things. This is normal at any age. What they're doing is a malicious distortion of reality." He taught me to document everything, my daily activities, conversations, decisions, to prove I was perfectly capable of living independently. It was sad having to prove my own sanity, but it was necessary. The lawsuit also attacked my decision to seek legal help, painting this as paranoid and litigious behavior typical of people with cognitive decline. According to them, a mentally sound person would never sue their own family, and the fact that I had hired a lawyer was proof I was being manipulated by third parties interested in causing family division. The perverse logic was impressive. If I did nothing, it was because I didn't have the capacity to react. If I reacted, it was because I was being manipulated. They had created a legal maze where any movement of mine would be interpreted as evidence of my incapacity. Dr. Miller also discovered that Jason had consulted lawyer colleagues to build the strongest possible case against me. "Eleanor, he's not improvising. This lawsuit was carefully planned by someone who knows all the legal loopholes." Apparently, Jason had specialization in family law and knew exactly how to manipulate the system. They had even hired a private psychiatrist, Dr. Henriksen, who had never examined me, but who signed a report based on reports from concerned family members, suggesting I had signs compatible with senile dementia. How could a doctor give a diagnosis without even knowing me? The ethical corruption of this situation was revolting. The most painful aspect of the lawsuit was reading how they described our family relationship. According to the document, I was a possessive and controlling mother who always had difficulties accepting her daughter's independence. They painted Laura as a dedicated daughter who tried to maintain a loving relationship despite her mother's increasingly difficult behavior. They transformed years of unconditional love into a narrative where I was the toxic villain and she was the patient victim. Every line was a cruel rewrite of our story, where my maternal love became pathology and their betrayal became care. It was like watching my own life being destroyed on paper. Dr. Miller showed me the lawsuit, even included an analysis of my social media. Yes, they had searched through my Facebook. "Eleanor, they're using your posts as evidence. Here, for example, they highlight that you shared several news stories about scams against the elderly, saying this demonstrates obsessive concern and paranoia." It was unbelievable. I shared those news stories precisely to alert other elderly people about dangers, and they turned that into a symptom of mental illness. Any attempt of mine to inform and protect myself was interpreted as evidence of my incapacity. The manipulation was so sophisticated it was frightening. Their strategy also included disqualifying all the people who could support me. Rose Turner, my neighbor who had defended me, was described as an elderly person equally susceptible to influences and with a history of neighborhood conflicts. Dr. Evelyn Reed, who had helped me at the community center, was painted as a therapist with commercial interest in prolonging unnecessary treatments. Even Dr. Miller was attacked in the lawsuit, being described as a lawyer with a history of promoting lucrative family litigation. They weren't just attacking me. They were trying to destroy the credibility of anyone who could defend me. What impressed me most was discovering the lawsuit included a financial analysis of my life, done by an accountant hired by them. According to this report, I had erratic spending patterns and questionable financial decisions in recent years. As an example, they cited that I had bought expensive clothes, an $80 dress for a friend's birthday, and had unnecessary spending on decoration. Some plants I bought to brighten the house after my husband's death. Every penny I spent on myself was transformed into evidence of deteriorating financial judgment. It was a complete violation of my privacy and autonomy. Dr. Miller explained we would need to counterattack each of these allegations with concrete evidence. Eleanor, we're going to prove you're not only mentally capable, but also that you've been the victim of an elaborate scheme of financial abuse and manipulation. He had already gotten copies of my real medical records, which showed I was in perfect mental health. He also had recordings of Jason's threats and all the documentation from the fake nurse case. They may have put together an impressive legal circus, but the truth is on our side. Preparing for the trial became an obsession for me. Every day I reviewed my version of the facts, practiced possible questions their lawyer might ask, and gathered evidence of my normal, independent life. Dr. Miller taught me that in court, every detail matters, from how I would dress to how I would answer questions. Eleanor, you'll have to prove your sanity before a judge who has never seen you before, based only on a few hours of hearing. The pressure was immense, but I knew this was my only chance to recover not only my money, but my freedom. In the days before the hearing, I had moments of panic thinking about all the possibilities. What if the judge believed their lies? What if my age weighed against me? What if I couldn't express myself well under pressure? Dr. Miller always reassured me, Eleanor, truth has its own power, and you have something they don't have, integrity. But still, it was scary knowing my entire life depended on a few hours in a courtroom. This emotional story was reaching its most crucial moment, and I knew I wouldn't have a second chance. It was all or nothing. That night, I stayed awake, late, thinking about how I had reached this point. My ungrateful daughter, whom I carried in my arms, whom I raised with so much love, was now trying to legally destroy me to cover up her own crimes. And Jason, whom I received like a son in my heart, was using his profession to attack me in the most cowardly way possible. But one thing they didn't know. This elderly mother had more fight in her than they imagined. And with Dr. Miller by my side, I was going to prove I wasn't a confused and incapable old woman. I was a strong woman who wouldn't let herself be defeated by people without character. The emotional story was reaching its climax, and they were about to discover they had completely underestimated the wrong woman. The day of the trial arrived, and I'll never forget how I felt entering that courthouse. My heart was beating so hard, it felt like it would come out of my mouth, but an iron determination took hold of me. I wore my best navy blue dress, had my hair done at the salon the night before, and carried an organized folder with all the documents. When I saw my ungrateful daughter Laura and gold-digging son-in-law Jason sitting on the other side of the room, surrounded by expensive lawyers, I felt a mixture of pain and rage. How had this elderly mother reached the point of being in a courtroom facing her own family? The courthouse was fuller than I expected. There were journalists, other lawyers observing the case, and even some people from the community center who came to support me. Judge Margaret Thompson was a woman in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back in an austere bun and a serious expression that didn't reveal which way she leaned. When she entered the room, everyone stood up, and I felt a chill in my stomach, thinking that my entire life was going to be decided by this woman. Dr. Miller gave me a discreet wink and whispered that the truth would speak louder in this emotional story. The first surprise came when Dr. Miller presented Dr. Evelyn Reed as our first witness. She entered the courthouse with a huge folder under her arm and a serious expression that immediately reassured me. When Dr. Evelyn began speaking about my complete psychiatric evaluation, every word was like a stone being lifted from my shoulders. She had subjected me to memory tests, logical reasoning, decision-making capacity, temporal and spatial orientation, things I didn't even know existed. Finally, someone was going to tell the truth about my mental condition in this real story. The evaluation Dr. Evelyn presented was so detailed, it even impressed me. Mrs. Hayes scored 28 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination, which is considered excellent for her age group, she said, showing charts to the judge. My cognitive reflexes were totally preserved. My memory functioned perfectly, and I demonstrated full capacity to make complex decisions about finances and personal life. Seeing the surprised faces of my ungrateful daughter's lawyers was priceless. They clearly didn't expect this emotional story to have so much scientific evidence on my side. What moved me most was when Dr. Evelyn began dismantling, one by one, all the unfounded allegations they had made in the lawsuit. She explained to the judge that being suspicious when you have real reasons isn't paranoia, it's intelligence, and that I wasn't delusional about conspiracy. Mrs. Hayes isn't imagining things. She documented unauthorized bank transfers worth more than $40,000. These are verifiable facts in the bank statements, she said with authority. Every word of hers was like medicine, healing the wounds that their lies had opened in my soul as a betrayed elderly mother. Dr. Evelyn also presented what she called an analysis of the family financial abuse pattern, something that made me feel less alone in the world. With charts and statistics, she showed the judge how cases like mine are more common than people imagine, and how aggressors frequently try to disqualify their victims by alleging mental incapacity. It's a classic tactic, Your Honor. When abuse is discovered, the perpetrators try to reverse roles, transforming the victim into the villain, she explained, citing international studies and similar cases. My ungrateful daughter's lawyer tried to question her credibility, but Dr. Evelyn had 25 years of experience and an impeccable resume. During questioning by Laura's defense attorney, I witnessed one of the most elegant intellectual demolitions I've ever seen in my life. Dr. Reed, don't you think a 71-year-old lady naturally has some cognitive limitations that the family needs to consider? Said the lawyer with a condescending tone. Her response was surgical. Sir, age alone is not an indicator of incapacity. We have presidents, Supreme Court justices, and CEOs who are 71 or older making decisions that affect millions of people daily. She made a dramatic pause before continuing that suggesting incapacity simply due to age was legally incorrect and ethically questionable. When my turn came to testify, I felt a mixture of terror and determination I had never experienced before. Dr. Miller had prepared me for hours, but still, when the judge called me to speak, I felt weak legs and a dry mouth. Mrs. Hayes, I'd like you to tell me, in your own words, what happened, said the judge, with a gentle but firm voice. That's when all the pain, all the betrayal, all the accumulated indignation came out of my mouth clearly and organized. I told about the ignored birthday, about discovering the unauthorized transfers, about the threats from the gold-digging son-in-law, making clear that this emotional story was real. The cross-examination was the hardest part of the entire legal process. Laura's lawyer tried to confuse me with tricky questions about specific dates, exact amounts, technical details that any normal person would have difficulty remembering. But I was prepared thanks to training with Dr. Miller, and when he tried to suggest I was exaggerating the situation, I responded firmly. Doctor, subtracting $40,000 from your own mother's account without authorization isn't a demonstration of affection. It's embezzlement, I said, looking directly at him. The audience fell into absolute silence, and I saw the judge taking notes intensively in her notepad. One of the most insidious questions came when the lawyer tried to make me admit I had chronic relationship problems with Laura since always. He questioned whether we didn't fight about her career choices, about her marriage with Jason, about financial decisions. I took a deep breath, remembering the advice about staying calm, and responded, Doctor, show me a mother who has never worried about her children's choices. I paused and looked at my ungrateful daughter, who looked away. Besides, if I were really controlling, why did she continue having access to my accounts for so long? Controlling people don't give that kind of trust. Rose Turner's testimony was an emotional moment that filled me with gratitude for life. That brave and loyal woman, my neighbor for more than 10 years, entered the courthouse with the posture of someone who wasn't afraid to speak the truth. Your Honor, I've known Eleanor Hayes for a decade. She's one of the most lucid, organized, and independent people I know, she said with total conviction. Rose told in detail about the day of the invasion, when Laura and the gold-digging son-in-law invaded my house, trying to force me to sign documents, witnessing direct threats and physical intimidation. Eleanor has nothing incapable about her. She's a victim of family abuse, not dementia, she declared firmly. Dr. Miller's strategy to disqualify Mr. Smith was brilliant and necessary in this real story. He presented official documents showing that Smith had sued our family 3 years ago over a territorial dispute about a fence that was judged completely unfounded. The lawsuit was unfounded, but Mr. Smith maintained resentment since then, Dr. Miller explained. And when Smith was called to testify, he became visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Smith, didn't you tell Mrs. Martinez that you would get back at Eleanor one of these days? Dr. Miller questioned directly. Smith stuttered, tried to deny, but ended up admitting he maybe had expressed himself poorly about me in the past. The presentation of the recording of the gold-digging son-in-law Jason's threats was the definitive turning point in the trial. Dr. Miller had advised me to record all conversations after the first intimidations, and thank God I faithfully followed his advice. Your Honor, I want you to hear with your own ears the voice of my client's son-in-law directly threatening an elderly woman, he said, before playing the audio. When the recording began playing in the room with Jason speaking coldly about declaring me incompetent and putting me in a nursing home where I belonged, the climate in the courthouse changed radically. Even my ungrateful daughter turned pale hearing her husband's voice in this emotional story of family betrayal. The final blow came when Dr. Miller presented all the documentation about the fake nurse case, including her complete testimony at the police station. Your Honor, while my client is being accused of paranoia and delusions, the petitioners hired an unemployed actress to pose as a healthcare professional and try to forge legal documents, he explained, showing the evidence. The judge became visibly disturbed and indignant with this information, asking to see the original documents the fake nurse tried to make me sign. How could people who committed crimes accuse me of mental incapacity? The hypocrisy was too blatant to be ignored and too painful to watch. But I knew in my heart that I had done the right thing, that I had fought for truth and justice. This emotional story was rapidly reaching its end, and the judicial decision that would change my life forever would be announced the following week. The day of the sentencing arrived on a cold October morning, and I confess I could barely sleep the night before. Almost 2 months had passed since I discovered my ungrateful daughter's betrayal, and now I would finally know if justice really existed in this world. Dr. Miller came to pick me up at 8 in the morning, and during the trip to the courthouse he tried to calm me. Eleanor, prepare yourself for anything, but I firmly believe we have a solid case. I arrived at the forum with weak legs, but with a heart full of hope. This elderly mother had fought with all her strength, had exposed the truth, had faced her own family. Now all that remained was to trust that justice would do its part and protect a 71-year-old woman who just wanted to live in peace with her dignity intact. The courthouse was packed, fuller than any of the previous hearings. Besides journalists and curious lawyers, I saw several people from the community center who came to support me. Rose Turner was in the front row, giving me strength with that encouraging smile I so needed. When my ungrateful daughter Laura and gold-digging son-in-law Jason entered, they looked defeated. She with swollen eyes from crying, he with a bitter expression of someone who already knew the result. The marriage that once seemed so prosperous and happy now showed two people destroyed by their own choices in this emotional story. Judge Margaret Thompson entered the room with a more serious expression than normal, and when she sat down, the silence was total. We are here today to pronounce the sentence in the case where petitioners Laura Hayes Patterson and Jason Patterson request partial guardianship of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes for alleged mental incapacity, she said with a firm voice. My heart raced. My entire life, my freedom, my dignity depended on the next words that would come from that woman's mouth. This real story was reaching its decisive moment, where an elderly mother fought for her own dignity. Dr. Miller discreetly held my hand, transmitting strength and confidence. The magistrate began methodically dismantling all the lies my ungrateful daughter and gold-digging son-in-law had told. The psychiatric evaluation demonstrated unequivocally that Mrs. Eleanor Hayes possesses full mental capacity, she declared, and the allegations of forgotten transfers are not sustained before the banking evidence that shows systematic and unauthorized movements. She analyzed the most serious evidence against Laura and Jason, recognizing that I had been the victim of a criminal scheme. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes demonstrated being lucid, articulate, and perfectly capable of understanding complex issues, the judge continued, validating my fight in this emotional story. The sentence was a complete and overwhelming victory for this elderly mother who dared to fight against her own family. This court completely denies the request for guardianship of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, said the judge with a firm and clear voice. Furthermore, in light of the evidence of crimes presented, it will order copies of the case files to be sent to the public prosecutor's office for criminal investigation. The petitioners were obligated to fully restore the $40,627 they had stolen from me, plus interest and monetary correction. Laura and Jason's criminal marriage was crumbling along with their plans to rob me in this real story of justice. The judge ended the session with words, "I'll keep forever in my heart," praising my courage as an example for other elderly people who are victims of family abuse. "We hope this case serves as an example for other families and shows that our society will not tolerate elderly people being exploited," she declared before banging the gavel. Leaving the courthouse, I was surrounded by people congratulating me. Dr. Miller said my courage would inspire many other people. I looked back and saw my ungrateful daughter Laura and gold-digging son-in-law Jason leaving defeated and humiliated, reaping exactly what they had sown in this emotional story of an elderly mother who didn't let herself be defeated. The marriage that should have given me grandchildren and joy had given me only pain and betrayal. But could I, at 71, completely rebuild my life and find a happiness I never imagined possible? After winning in court and recovering the $40,000 my daughter Laura and son-in-law Jason stole, I decided to completely restart my life. I sold my house and moved to a small town in the California countryside, where I bought a little house with a garden I had always dreamed of having. At 71, I discovered my passion for gardening, enrolling in classes at the community center, and creating a beautiful garden with roses, carnations, and an organic vegetable patch. My house became a meeting point for new, true friends, without ulterior motives. 3 months after the move, I discovered the Protected Elderly NGO and became a volunteer, helping elderly victims of family and financial abuse. I created a specific support group for these victims, where people like Mrs. Rosa, Mr. Antonio, and Mrs. Marta share their stories of family betrayal. Inspired by the group's conversations, I decided to write a book about my experience, titled, "At 71, I Discovered I Can Still Fight." My story began inspiring people across the country, from elderly people who found courage to report abuse to lawyers who specialized in the area. 1 year after the sentence, I became a completely different person, stronger, independent, and confident. My new life is richer and more meaningful than the previous one, with daily purpose between the garden, work at the NGO, and writing the book. Laura and Jason, by trying to destroy me, actually freed me, showing that I didn't need them to be happy. At 72, I discovered that life really begins when we decide to be truly free. And have you ever experienced something similar in your family? Do you know someone who might be a victim of family financial abuse? What would you do if you discovered that people close to you were taking advantage of you or your parents? Sometimes we think these things only happen to others, but the reality is that abuse of the elderly is much more common than we imagine. The difference between being a victim and being a survivor lies in the courage to act when we discover the truth. If this story touched your heart, if you were moved by my journey of pain and overcoming, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring important life lessons. Share this video with people who need to hear that it's never too late to fight for justice and dignity. Because sometimes a real story like mine can be exactly what someone needs to hear to find strength and not give up on their own dreams, regardless of their age. Until the next emotional story,